Anyone who's a regular viewer of this program knows that I think the left does almost nothing about U.S. military policy and foreign policy, and that it should become an internationally focused movement again. And our next guest is doing a lot to make that happen, and she has a new report out. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of Code Pink, the women-led peace group. She's also co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange. She has written a number of books in this area, including Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And she is the co-author of a new report entitled War Profiteers that talks about, well, I'll let her tell us what it's about. So first of all, Medea, thanks for coming back on the program.
Hey, Richard, thanks for having me on. And yes, we did this new report on the war profiteers looking at the top 5 weapons contractors, the Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Raytheon. And we look at the weapons sales to 3 overseas countries, to Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt, and how in each of those cases, those weapons makers have been complicit in supporting war crimes committed by those countries. And we go into great detail in each of the companies, in a number of incidents that have been reported or we have dug up that show how these weapons are being used. And it's all too rare where we actually make the connection between civilians being killed on the ground in a place like Yemen, where Saudi Arabia has been so involved, or in Gaza, where the Israelis have been involved, or Egypt, where it's killing its own people, and the weapons companies that make those weapons.
Yeah, I think this is so important because it starts to speak to the web of forces that we got drawn into, and in some cases spin as a nation ourselves, and the fact that we really don't talk about it in this country nearly enough. It took we've been very, very actively involved in helping the Saudi government, working with the Saudi government in creating one of the worst literally one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern times, perhaps the worst one in the world today in Yemen. And we've on this show, we've gone over the statistics in great deal, horrifying as they are, of what's happening in Yemen. But, you know, it didn't get any coverage on MSNBC or anywhere else for a very long time. I think over a year in MSNBC's case, someone did a study until a Saudi missile attack targeted a school bus and killed perhaps as many as 50 children. And then it turns out that a U.S. Missile was used in that attack and in others around Yemen. But I guess I want to start with the scope of these atrocities is terrible, and why don't the American people know about it?
They don't know about it because the media doesn't report on it. There's such a disconnect, Richard. On the one hand, you have these companies, and Fortune magazine just has a front cover story that makes me sick reading it. It's all about how women are now the heads of these companies. You have General Dynamics that is headed by a woman, and you have women rising to the top of these companies, and it's all in there of saying we're role models. We can show that we women can do these kinds of jobs, and they put themselves forth as members of their communities and their mothers, and they're very respected in their fields. And I'm thinking, you know, these women have blood on their hands, just like the men who came before them have blood on their hands. And it's an industry that can only thrive through chaos, conflict, war crimes. This is their marketing is more conflict, more war. And you read the testimonies, they talk to these women, and they're saying, there's never been a time of more conflict. And we have all these countries in the Middle East, and then we have Russia, and then we have China. And, you know, their job is to hype up the fear and the threats that we are facing as a nation, so that they can sell more weapons. And it's really just absolutely immoral and disgusting that we have built up these weapons companies as if they're great public citizens, and totally disconnected from what their products do in the real world.
Breaking the glass ceiling with a shoulder-fired missile, I guess you could call it. But no, it is horrifying and appalling, and all of the cable channels, including CNN and MSNBC, use retired generals and others who make millions consulting with these companies and never identify their conflicts of interest when they patiently explain to the American people why war with Iran or other weapon sales of these kinds are necessary. And it's outrageous and appalling. So in addition to these companies depending on chaos and conflict and bloodshed and death, they also depend on ignorance, I guess we would say.
And let me add one other conflict of interest, which is everybody that's elected to represent us on the national level, every single member of the House, the Senate, everybody in the White House. They have a tremendous conflict of interest because they take money from the weapons industries. Even a lot of the good ones, like Bernie Sanders, took $300,000 from the weapons industry during his 2016 campaign. Even somebody who's runs the Human Rights Commission in Congress, Jim McGovern, takes money from the weapons industry. And they vote on the Pentagon budget every year. They are supposed to vote on whether we go to war, and yet how can they have this conflict of interest where they really are connected to the very industry that benefits from war? So that's another kind of conflict that we should demand that every member of Congress take a pledge that they're not going to take money from the weapons industry.
And that's the political dimension of this, and that's how we get to a situation where Congress votes the military, what was it, 700 billion or enormous sum more over a 10-year period than it had even asked for, and all your progressive, I say your, as a figure of speech, all your progressive heroes voted for it. Well, I'm not sure I don't think Bernie did actually, but so many of them did. When it was basically just this lavish gift of the people's money on these defense companies. What was the figure, by the way? It was a stunning figure.
717 billion, a 13% increase. And yes, the majority of people in Congress just voted for it without blinking an eye. And as you were implying, this is money that is stolen from other things that we so desperately need in this country. And this is something that we were warned about in 1961 by President/General Eisenhower, said, beware of the military-industrial congressional complex. And here we have it, bigger and more dangerous today than ever before, with Trump lauding about how he has increased weapons sales. And also, it's not just sales. In the case of Israel and Egypt, it's our tax dollars that are going to pay for these other countries to have an increased number of weapons and higher tech weapons, and all of them used for war crimes that don't get prosecuted, unfortunately.
In many cases, as you point out, they don't get prosecuted because the United States vetoes resolutions in the UN to at least sanction them. I think that it's really important. I just want to add, by the way, that as much money as we're talking about, to me, and I imagine you agree, the principal concern here is moral and ethical. When we vote $717 billion more dollars to the military-industrial complex, death, my feeling is more death results. That there is, and that in fact, morally, we should not be participating in this process through our government or as a people. And I see your report, your War Profiteers report, which you co-authored with Nicholas Davies. I see that as a way of, pointing out to people the sort of causal link. Money gets voted, People don't know about it. It is used, in the case of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, with the active participation of the U.S. military to commit these atrocities, with the use of U.S. dollars going to the human rights and other violations taking place in Egypt and Israel. So we really have a system where the financing may be, greed may be the motive behind people's actions, but death is the output.
Exactly. And more recently, we had a prime example of that when the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, actually went against what the majority of people that were advising him in the State Department said, which is things are getting really bad in Yemen, too many civilians getting killed. We shouldn't certify that Saudi Arabia is really doing its best to protect civilians. Mike Pompeo went ahead and certified because he and one of his advisors, Charles Faulkner, was a lobbyist for Raytheon, and they were worried about a $2 billion contract for Raytheon that would have been canceled had they not done this occasion.
So, okay, I mean, we got a little garbled there for a second, but basically, there was a $2 billion contract for Raytheon involved, and unfortunately, that is what this is about. So I guess I would ask you, Medea Benjamin, besides reading your report at Code Pink, what can people do about all of this?
Well, we have started a campaign to divest from the war machine, and it's very exciting, Richard, because it follows in the footsteps of the environmentalists who have gotten trillions of dollars out of the fossil fuel industry by going to cities, states, pension funds, faith-based institutions, and getting people to divest. So we are doing the same thing. We created a new fund. It's called Weapons Free Fund, where you can look up all of these different investment firms and see whether they are invested in weapons, and then take that to your city, to your pension fund, to your church, and tell them that you want them to pass a resolution to not invest in the war machine. And the other part of this is to get our elected representatives to pledge not to take money from the weapons industry. So it's very exciting. We have something that everybody can get involved in, and you can find out more information at codepink.org. Okay, so that's great information. Thanks, Medea. And we have about a minute left, and I guess I want to close by saying, I do wonder, and I want to ask you, I do wonder why it is that, I remember the days when the left was galvanized around issues of war and peace, and I know part of that was Vietnam. Young men were afraid of getting drafted, so there was a personal dimension, but also nuclear war and all of that. We've had Dan Ellsberg on the show talking about the fact that nuclear war is still a real threat. How do we get the left to galvanize itself around foreign policy the same way it has, to a certain extent, galvanized around issues of economics and social justice? When it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue, I think we have a lot of people galvanized, and we just have to build on that. There are many members of the Jewish community and the Palestinian community working together, bringing that into the realm of folks in Black Lives Matter to show the similarities, the Native Americans, taking them to Palestine. So that's an example I think that we can build on. It's hard when you don't get media coverage, and certainly it's very hard to take people to places like Yemen. But I think with the case of a pending war in Iran, the way this administration is going, people better understand this is just the same thing that happened over 16 years ago to build a case for war with Iraq, and look what happened there. We must come together and stop the administration from taking us into another war in the Middle East. So once again, you can contact Code Pink. We have a summit on Iran coming up in December 1st. We're taking a large delegation, a peace delegation of 100 people to Iran. We have a social media campaign to talk directly to people in Iran. So those are part of our efforts to galvanize more interest in stopping the next war now.
Well, this is great information, and I hope when these events move forward and the trip moves forward that you'll come back and talk to us about it.
Terrific. I would love to. Thank you so much for having me on, Richard.